Well, good afternoon, everybody, unless you're in Hawaii or Alaska. Actually, it's funny. I just said that, and I see one of the folks in the audience is in Alaska. So, anyway, happy noon in the Pacific and 11 a.m. in Alaska. Today, we're going to be talking about getting O365 set for security. I assume that everybody in the audience has O365 or is moving to O365. I was just talking to somebody yesterday who they don't have O365, and that they were coming to this so that when their organization moves to O365 they can get there. So as we say hello here, as you can see, Susie and a couple other folks in the chat already letting us know where they're joining from. So let us know where you're joining from, and I'd be curious to know if you have O365 or if you're moving to O365. That'd be great. I am in Seattle, and the other folks on here are joining from various other places in Washington State. So anyway, welcome everybody. We have a ton of content to bring you today. And John Luke, who some of you know if you've been to our events before, has gone a little crazy with the number of slides. So I do want to let everyone know off the top that we are going to email out the slides afterwards. So if there's some detail in there as he goes through a bit of a demo, we will email it to you later. There is chat on the right. If you haven't been to our events before, the chat is a real big portion of our events. We try to do panels. We try to answer a lot of questions. Let us know what you're thinking about. Let us know what your questions are. And I love interrupting the panelists with your questions. So put them in there. We'll get them answered. We'll either answer them in chat or I'll bring them up in the panel. If the chat for some of you is going boop 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 boop, and right at the top there's a little bell with a and if you click the bell, then it puts a line through it and then it's muted. If you want the chat to go boop 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 boop, then click it and you won't have the little line through it. You will get a recording of this. So after this, we're going to send out an email that has the recording and another email that has the PowerPoint in it. One thing to note is the first email you get that comes from this Livestorm system that we use for webinars is only viewable for you. And then the YouTube link is obviously viewable to the entire world because it's YouTube. You know how that works. And we appreciate you all being here. If you don't know us, Critical Insight, we're a cybersecurity company that defends critical infrastructure against cyber attacks. Critical infrastructure is cities, counties, hospitals, other healthcare entities, manufacturing, and the like. We help organizations prepare for a cyber attack. We help them detect one quickly, and we help them respond decisively. And when we talk about detection, that's our Security Operations Center, which Lola runs. So I'll talk about that in a second. Is somebody saying they can't hear anything? So, Ginny, if you can help that person. Ginny is our event coordinator, event manager, and she'll help folks if they have questions in the chat. Fred Langston is one of our founders. He's also our chief product officer. John Luke Peck is our deputy CISO and our director of incident response and our O365 expert. He wears a lot of hats, despite not wearing any hats today. And Lola Morse is our SOC manager. You might have seen her on a couple of other events that we have. And she's going to talk about how the SOC uses O365. Her part of the presentation will be really cool. The others will be good too. My name is Jake Milstein. I run marketing and I'm the event host. And it's nice to see you all. One more note before we get started here. If anybody has any questions that you don't want to put in the chat, you can always email me at jake@criticalinsight.com. And I will ask your questions anonymously. I know that comes up every now and then, and I will not reveal to anybody who asked the question. So email me if you have a question. So we're going to start by talking about O365 security, why you should care. Then O365 configuration and setup with John Luke, and then O365 SOC, how a SOC responds to an incident in O365. Fred.
Yeah.
Start us off, sir.
Sure. I get the fun stuff. I get to tell you all the bad things that can happen here. So The reasons we care is because anything that can happen in O365 are the same things that can happen to email, can happen in a website, or it can happen with a file sharing server, right? Because SharePoint is part of that suite and it's just a big file server, right? So all the things that we can see going wrong on an on-prem network are the same things that can go wrong in O365. So we're worried about credential theft. Phishing is probably our number one threat. Everybody's facing this all day, every day. What happens though once somebody is successfully done a phishing attack? They have your credentials. When they're probably going to do other things. They're going to do more phishing. They're going to try to steal things. They're going to log onto SharePoint. They may try to get into Teams. Anything that's exposed that they have a login that they can use, they're going to be in there. They're going to be looking around. They're going to be taking things. They're going to do business email compromise, BEC. I'll talk about that on the next slide in a little bit in depth on the differing types and variants of business email compromise. And then there's threats even when multi-factor authentication is in place. Even if they do get your credentials, we know that, well, there are methods to get you to go to a website, steal your authentication token, and then try to replay that. And you may get a prompt to click on your MFA on your phone, not realizing that you're actually letting the bad guy in instead of yourself. Or even they can go steal, if it's targeted, they really are trying to get to you. It's intellectual property they're trying to steal. They'll go steal your laptop once they have your creds. They'll just log in locally, right? So even with multi-factor, there are still other ways for them to get around that and get to your data. The other things that happen is they're going to have malware. They're going to drop some malware on there, which leads to more malware, ransomware, killware, botnets, crypto mining, remote access Trojans, and rootkits. Pretty much anything in the malware zoo is potentially something that can get dropped on your system. Next slide, please. So let's talk about business email compromise, because people, while they know what it is, they don't know the kind of modalities, the different ways this can happen. One that most people are familiar with is, hey, my vendor got compromised and they sent me an email that said, hey, they're changing their account and I'm supposed to pay them at this account. And it turns out that that account is now in Ukraine. So that happens when a bad guy is compromised the other side's email. It could also be you got phished and you got compromised. Maybe they're watching what's happening coming into your email, making changes as a man in the middle, watching everything that's happening. And they're making changes on your side, which is something that's your problem. So there's a difference here. One of them is a problem on your third party. They have the problem and it's attacking you, or you are the problem and you are the launch or the source of attacks on other people. So there's a number of ways you can be in here. And there's a third way this happens. If you do not have good DNS email controls, it's called Sender Protection Framework, SPF. DKIM. DKIM is a cryptographic method of validating that you are the sender from this domain. And DMARC is an umbrella that all those two other measures sit under. These are things that everyone should have in place for email servers, because if you don't, people can send email, looks like it comes from your domain, and it will not be blacklisted or blocked because you do not have these records in place. So you can still look like it's coming from you, attacking your partners, or frankly, anyone. And these are all things that you need to get ahead of to make sure you have in place. All of these are malicious in the middle attacks. So, some malicious actor is in the middle, watching what's going on, manipulating the conversation, manipulating the responses. They are usually passive at first. They're watching, watch. When I finally see my opportunity to get in and manipulate the conversation, manipulate the outcomes, that's when I become active. So they watch until they need to jump in the middle. And they're after money. They're after data. They're after intellectual property. No big surprise there. Next slide, please. And we'll kind of just wrap up the bad things that can happen. Well, remember, they can use email if they have a compromised account to exfiltrate data. That's a really easy way to get past the controls you have, potentially data loss prevention controls you may have on your firewall, maybe getting past going through email, especially if it's O365, which is not on premise. They may add mail rules, forwarders, auto deletes, complex actions that allow them to retain control. Even if you go in and change the password and they can't log in anymore, they may still be seeing the emails because they've set up rules. If somebody's actually has a high level, so if I compromise a user with admin credentials, I may be able to even add users. I can hide those users from other people in the system. I can launch internal email denial of service attacks. I can just start spamming everybody in the company and shut the company down. Maybe I'm just going to use that email address to launch my own spam campaign, send out a couple 100,000 emails an hour trying to sell widgets on the internet. Maybe it's for click fraud. It's better really to ask, again, what they can't do. It's a file server. It's an email system, right? It's pretty much everything you have on-prem wrapped into a little environment online. So the threats are real and the threats are complex. Next slide, and I believe it's the next person.
Thanks, Fred, and I appreciate you lending us your credit card so we could punch a hole in it for that picture. All right, John Luke, planning for security. Go for it.
All right. So we're going to be talking about some of the things to be thinking about here while you're getting ready to set up Office 365, or maybe if you've already got it, or you're using it in a certain way, but you're looking at advancing the ways that you're using it here. There's going to be stuff in here for you. So first off, it's important to plan the deployment first. Whether you're a startup with 2 employees or a large multinational with thousands of employees and existing on-premise Office networks, the decisions you're going to make now as you're choosing to set it up, as you're selecting configuration options, they're going to have ripple effects for months and years into the future. They're going to be things that you and your IT team and your employees are all living with as you're using it day to day. Now, cloud only is great for small businesses, startups, and remote employers. What we mean by that is just Office 365. There's no like on-premise file servers. There's no Active Directory in an office, which is synchronizing or anything. Everybody's just using O365 remotely. It's very easy to get that set up. It just needs a credit card, and usually you're up and running and accepting email within a few hours. But maybe if you already do have, or you're going to have a physical presence like an office or a headquarters or a data center, this is where some complex decisions are going to need to be made. If you've got Wi-Fi, are you going to want Wi-Fi to be tied to Office 365, where in order to get onto your company network, somebody has to have an active user account? Because that's absolutely something you can do. It's just got to be planned ahead of time. Remote access. Do you want people to be getting in by a VPN? Do you want them to use their Office 365 accounts for that? Or do you want them to be able to connect up and get email from anywhere in the country or anywhere in the world? Some organizations choose to use Office 365 like a resource where it's receiving updates from the on premise network. Or you can choose to have Office 365 itself be what we call the source of truth. This is where changes are made in Active Directory on Office 365 side, and then they synchronize or they propagate over to the on premise environments. There's a whole plethora of options, and it's important to look at these and decide what you need today and what you want to be ready for in the future and what you know you don't want, because those are all going to affect the decisions and the configuration options that you're working on now. So endpoint security planning is another major part of Office 365. Employees are going to be connecting up to O365 from something, whether that's a company computer or their iPhones or their personal computers. And you want to make sure that you're aware of this and that you've set policies, both technical and administrative, about how this is going to go. There's no point in investing tons of time and money in setting up a really secure Office 365 environment if, for example, your employees are all using personally owned computers that are long out of date. They've got some janky antivirus that probably wants a credit card number in order to work again, and they're being used by the kids to do their homework and play Minecraft when mom and dad aren't using it. So there are risks that have to be factored into this as well. Decisions that need to be made at this stage include: is the company going to buy devices for employees? Are you going to be providing computers and phones? Or are you going to be asking employees to bring their own devices? Where will employees be allowed to connect from? Are you going to require it to be in the office or through a VPN? Or can they get to wherever they may live and reside? Or do you want access to be global? And then third, how are we going to protect company data on these devices? How are we going to make sure that the computers, whether we own them, the company owns them, or employees own them, are set up and secured so that we can trust those devices with the work activities that employees are going to be using? And other things to think about include intellectual property. This is kind of a weird one to be bringing into a discussion along these lines, but it's a big factor, especially for startups and smaller organizations. If employees are using personally owned devices to conduct company business, does the company actually own the intellectual property like you would assume? It's not a clear cut yes or no, unfortunately. And depending on the work your business does and the data and the information your employees handle, this should probably be reviewed with your business attorneys. Our general experience is that companies prefer to own the devices that work is being conducted on. That way, you can manage and secure the computer like you need to, and you can say clearly, this was a work product from a work owned computer, therefore, it is owned by the company. But what about things like just checking email from a personal computer? What about those times when an employee just needs to do that one thing real quick? So they just jump onto their personal computer, go into Office 365, approve themselves through MFA, get onto SharePoint, and they find that one slide that they need to update on that one PowerPoint deck that time. Can we trust that? Do we want to allow it? These are questions that have to be discussed in advance here. Contractors are another unique area. Some businesses use contractors like vendors, where they're saying, here's a thing and some money. Please send me a shiny finished thing when you're done. Others use contractors like employees, where they're being integrated into their work processes and team cultures. Do you want to require contractors to use company computers, for example, or do you want to trust that the contractor is as careful with their own work computers as you are going to want them to be? And then we have personal mobile devices. This is another area that has to be thought about. A lot of organizations are buying company computers, but they're asking employees to use personal phones that the employees own and pay for if they want to get email while they're not in front of their computer or outside of the office. Now, that's a very easy answer for the company, and that's great because it enables connectivity and communication without needing to buy iPhones for all of your employees. But what if your employees are using 5-year-old Android devices that don't get updates anymore? What if they like to play very high risk mobile app games, which are potentially loaded with spyware and advertisements? What if they've got Facebook on their phone, which is collecting GPS data and phone call logs? Do you still want that employee's personal phone to have access into your Office 365, email, and SharePoint libraries? So these are discussion topics that are important to look at and think about here before you dig out the credit card. One of the biggest areas we see organizations struggling with, and this is true if you are a small startup or a large multinational, almost nobody is doing this right across the board. And that's managing employee access to third party cloud and SaaS apps. What do we mean by that? Well, we're talking a lot about Office 365 right now, where employees go to portal.office.com or office365.com. They enter their info given to them by your employers, and then they're being productive. They're checking email, they're writing documents, they're doing their thing. When we talk about third party cloud and SaaS apps, we're talking about everything else on the internet. That's Salesforce, Dropbox, social media sites, HRIS services, expense management, CRM apps, the whole list of anything and everything your employees are likely to be touching in the course of business. All of those apps require someone to log in with an account. And what we're seeing very frequently is that employees are setting up those accounts as needed, and they're not telling their manager or telling IT about it. So then what happens when those employees leave, or if they change roles inside the company, or if the company needs to let them go, potentially not under the greatest of circumstances? How many exit interviews have you seen, which includes someone writing out all of the third party cloud and SaaS accounts, usernames, and passwords that they have for the next person in their role? It doesn't happen often. We do see it happen from time to time, but even when it does, I promise you it's not comprehensive. There is always stuff that is left over in the employees' heads which doesn't transfer over, oftentimes which IT has no idea about. So we go about solving this in a couple of ways. First is by using single sign-on wherever possible. Now, single sign-on is that service where if you go to mywebapp.com, it already knows you're logged into Office 365 and it uses those credentials and it lets you in. SSO tells web applications like Salesforce, Concur, and Dropbox that whenever someone logs in using mynewcompany.com, like employee at mynewcompany.com, that it should check with Office 365 to make sure that those usernames and passwords are still active and that they're correct. And then that someone, whether it's an employee or a rogue outsider, cannot create a new account using your company domain without your business or your IT team knowing about it. Now, the second part to that is using what we call a CASB, a cloud access security broker. And this is the monitoring point for third-party cloud and applications. CASBs are kind of like firewalls for cloud apps. They watch who is doing what where and they can enforce policies. If you want to allow people to sign in to Workday, your HRIS system, for example, from your home computer, that's great. But if you want to let people sign in and check email, but maybe not download attachments to a personal computer, you can build policies which prevent that. The two CASB services that we see most often are Microsoft Defender for cloud apps, used to be called Cloud App Security, and Jump Cloud. We've been hearing a lot of really good things about that. So this is a quick graphic talking about cloud security architecture, and in particular, the CASB service. If you figure everybody on the left there, the corporate HQ, people on their home Wi-Fi, external folks like contractors or business partners, they're connecting to all of the stuff in the blue cloud on the right here. So they're using Office 365 and Slack and GitHub and Concur and all these services. Those services then talk to Defender for cloud apps, relaying log information and asking for authentication data and making sure everybody's doing everything on the up and up. And that's where the firewalling process happens here. So this is just a quick architecture to show how it all kind of ties together and the importance of this. So then we get into deciding who's going to be watching for alerts. So it's important to make sure that as we set up these services, whether it's Office 365 or endpoint security software, they're going to be generating alerts. We got to make sure those alerts are going to go somewhere. And it's not enough to just get it into your inbox. If, for example, you're a small team, 5 people in a company, or maybe 5 people on an IT team, people sleep. This is just the nature of business. You can't expect people to be checking their email at 2 in the morning while they are sound asleep. But at the same time, if you get an email at 2 in the morning saying, hey, you've got a hacker knocking on your front door, that's not necessarily something that you want to wait until 9 a.m. or the next business hour. For example, if it's 2 in the morning on Friday and it's a holiday weekend, Tuesday morning may be the next time anybody's in the office. You don't necessarily want to wait 3 or 4 days before anybody takes a look at this. So that's where making sure that you've got a service, for example, such as managed detection and response, can receive those alerts, can triage them on the fly, and then know when to call and escalate an incident or an event to the right people in your team or on your service providers list. Now, I've got here on the left-hand side a list of the main areas where we see alerts coming from. So if you're a startup and you're thinking, what alerts do I need to be worried about? The stuff on the left side, O365, endpoints, configuration management, and CASBs, those are going to be the main ones to be thinking about. If you've got an on-premise environment, if you're setting up servers in an office, if you're setting up firewalls and Wi-Fi and stuff, those are the systems to be thinking about, and to make sure that you're getting alerts from those. And again, that those alerts are going somewhere that's going to be paying attention to them.
And hey, John-Luc,
Yeah.
a question came up in the chat here. And I know you have a bunch to get through, but I do want to make sure we answer some of the questions here. Don says one of the issues I worry about is using O365 logins as a third-party login. How do I stop a hacker from creating a pop-up that looks like a login to Microsoft, but is really their website and capturing username, password, then trying to log into O365 using those credentials? O365 sends the code and the user forwards it to the hacker, and now they're in. Fred, why don't you unmute and answer that?
Well, you can't. So the bad guys can create anything they want, and it's real easy because either they know what Microsoft tools look like or they know what your website pop-ups look like. So they're going to copy them literally to make them as identical as possible to that. And what you need to do is train your users to know, why am I trying to enter credentials online to something normally I just connect to? Might be one way to look at it. Why is it asking me to do this? Why am I authenticating? Is this really a place I want to authenticate to? By looking in the URL bar and figuring out where you're actually authenticating to. And if you don't know, don't do it. Call somebody up and ask if they actually sent you this link to a document that requires me to log in.
All right, John-Luc, keep going.
All right. So looking at the features and options that are available from Office 365, there's a ton of them. If you've ever seen it before, I've got a link down at the bottom here to this 9-page Microsoft document, which is one giant feature matrix. That little table that you see on the right, imagine 9 pages of that, and that is this document. And what this spells out is all of the features that are available under each license tier that you get. Why is this important? Well, each license tier also includes certain security features which may only be available at those license tiers. In addition, they've also got different levels of functionality, such as logging and retention. So an E3 license can store log data up to 90 days. An E5 license can store log data up to 365 days. But that's got to be configured first. It's not just I buy the license and now I've got the 365 days of log data. You've got to build a policy which says store this log over here for up to a year before that data starts being collected and retained. Why is this important, you ask? Well, as the director of incident response, I'm here to tell you. When we work for clients who have had an Office 365 incident and require an investigation, this log data is make or break for our ability to deliver a forensic result. If we don't have log data showing who clicked what when, who opened what email, who logged into which accounts from where, then we have to assume the worst in a lot of instances. We have to make recommendations to secure the potential big gaps that may be there. If we can see very clearly this user came in from this IP address and did these things, then not only do we know exactly what the scope is, what systems were touched, what files may have been accessed or compromised in some way, but we're also able to make very specific and targeted recommendations. Here's how they got in. Here's the phishing message that they used to steal credentials. Here's then where they got in from, Romania or wherever else around the world that they may be. And so there are very specific recommendations that can be used to plug those holes and close those gaps. If we don't have that log data, it's a lot harder for us to say, here's exactly what happened. There's a lot more hypothesizing which has to go into it. And then we're trying to help close the big gaps here, which is generally a good thing anyway. But it means, like I say, there's a bit more guesswork which goes along with it. So making sure that you're selecting these options both at the licensing level, that you are paying the right amount every month for the features that you need or you expect, but then also making sure that they're set up, that they're actually configured is the critical part there.
And there's always frustration that Microsoft doesn't make it more available to the people who need it. And yes, 100%.
Absolutely. Across the board. So, setting up Office 365 for security. What to set in order to set for security? First up, if you've ever heard of the term role-based access control, you're going to hear it a little bit more here. Role-based access control is a way of setting up groups and setting up roles, which then have permissions and responsibilities and capabilities assigned to them. Rather than granting user John Smith administrative rights, you put user John Smith into an admin group, which then has administrative rights assigned to it. What that does is make it easier to manage permissions and grab reports out of things so that you can make changes very quickly. You know exactly where security groups point to, for example, HR data that allows people who are in that security group to read data on the HR side of things, or a sales team, which adds people on your sales team to certain features or certain applications, for example. By adding employees into these groups and using groups to manage the roles, that helps make sure that you've got a stronger hierarchy in the directory structure, and that helps manage permissions to a much greater detailed extent. Why that's important is because when we need to come in and do a review for an incident, for example, it helps us identify which employees are supposed to be where. Should this employee who works in HR actually have access to all of this finance data? Should the CEO actually have access to all of this client data? All of these questions come up as we're examining logs, as we're recreating events and trying to understand what did a hacker get into. So RBAC, we are very big fans of. You will see this on just about every framework or standard out there, and we're definitely a proponent. Number two is multi-factor authentication. So this one is kind of a hot button item because there are a lot of organizations out there who think they've got Office 365 set up to require multi-factor authentication, when actually it's just set up in a nice to have kind of way. It's an option for employees rather than a requirement for them to be able to connect. So when you're deploying MFA through Office 365, first up, you have to enable it globally first. What we mean by that is you have to turn it on within Office 365 and make it available for people to set up. Then there's this second dashboard, what they call per user MFA. And that's where you can go through and set individual accounts to specifically require MFA. Now, in that configuration there, you can see it on the screenshot down below. There are three states that an employee can sit in. One is disabled. MFA is not allowed, not available, not allowed. Second is enabled. What that means is it's optional. You can use MFA if you want, but you don't have to. And then the third is enforced. That's making sure that it is absolutely required in order to connect. And that's what we prefer to see. We always recommend using enforced mode across the board because that makes it absolutely required at the user account level, not just, hey, MFA seems like a good idea. Why don't you try it? Oh, that didn't work. Here, let's just reset your password. That's normally how Office 365 is set up for most environments here. Up next is conditional access policies. So conditional access policies are like the firewall of your Office 365 environment. Now, I say your Office 365 environment because they are not global settings. They are not things which apply to all Office 365 users. They have to be set up and deployed in your instance, in your tenancy, in order to make sure they apply. The policies that we recommend setting up are number one, requiring multi-factor authentication. So if you've ever heard the term defense in depth, this is part of that strategy here. If we've turned on MFA at the per user level, now we're going to build a firewall policy through conditional access policies, which says I'm not even going to allow a connection unless it has been approved through multi-factor authentication here. So that gives you a second layer of defense to require MFA. Number two is using geo blocking. If you have all of your employees concentrated in a small number of countries, for example, if all of your employees are stateside, or if you know, yep, I've got 90% in the US and I've got 10% in the United Kingdom, for example, then allow logins from the US and the UK or whatever countries are applicable here. Block everywhere else. If you don't know, or if you don't have employees in Romania or South Africa or Eastern Europe, don't allow logins from there. Because if a login is allowed, then all it's going to take is an attacker who's going through guessing passwords, knocking on doors, and twisting doorknobs, trying to figure out, can I get in here? Now, if the policies say, I see you connecting from Romania, we're just going to say no to that, then they're just going to keep getting error messages and they're not going to fully understand why. They're just going to know the password attempt didn't work. You will know they can't connect successfully. So this is again defense in depth. We want to make sure that we're using these layered policies, limiting successful logons to only where we know employees are. Now, there's a big asterisk that goes along with that, and that is for employees who travel. It is very possible to set up an easy system so that when somebody's traveling, they let you know about it ahead of time. You put them into a travel exception group. They then are allowed to log in from around the world, wherever they may be. And then when they come back, you pull them out of that group so they are back to just stateside logins, for example. Number three is requiring modern authentication and blocking legacy authentication. So legacy authentication is essentially usernames and passwords, clear text type stuff, simple authentication, maybe triggers an MFA request, but probably doesn't. Think old school email clients just logging in to check email, for example. This is where Microsoft was seeing a huge percentage of attacks come from. Successful compromises typically were coming in through backdoors like old email clients running on outdated Android phones, and they were just getting in with a username and password, granting a token to the attacker, and then the attacker starts rifling through mailboxes, downloading SharePoint libraries, and sending out spam. If you require modern authentication is Microsoft's multi-factor auth. It uses encryption. It uses all kinds of new stuff that most modern apps these days, especially on mobile devices, do know how to speak. So by requiring that, you're essentially taking this big chunk of risk off the table entirely. We're making sure that apps have to be up to date. They've got to be speaking modern, successfully encrypted protocols, and it's going to require MFA as well, which is great. This fourth one here is called risk-based sign-in policies. What this does is essentially take a look at who's the user, where are they connecting from, and what device are they trying to use, and then decides, what do I need to do to verify this person here? If somebody's connecting from a company-owned computer at their home IP address, the same thing that they do every week, it's going to decide, I probably can trust who you are and where you're going. If suddenly they're trying to connect from a very strange computer on the other side of the world, then Microsoft's going to say, hey, hang on a second, I need you to MFA here. And if that doesn't work, then it's going to start sending up alerts and alarm bells saying something's going on. We need to take a look at this here. So I am a big fan of risk-based sign-in policies. That's an early detection method and can be a quick way to make sure that if there is something kind of shady happening, that Microsoft will require additional security in order to potentially stop it, but at the very least, verify the user. OneDrive and SharePoint. Now, again, from the incident response side, this is something that we see taken advantage of by attackers very, very frequently. A lot of organizations don't even know that these settings are out there, let alone that they've been set in a certain way. So on the left, what you see are the config panels for SharePoint and OneDrive, and what sharing do we want to allow outside the organization. As the picture that you're looking at is currently set up, we are allowing stuff to be shared with guests outside of the environment. So if you are employee at mycompany.com and you have a business partner or a client at client.com, you're able to send them an invitation. They can open up a document in your OneDrive or in your SharePoint library, do their work, and everybody's collaborating. Well, a lot of environments have stricter security that doesn't allow for that or doesn't want to allow for that. So that's where you can adjust those slider bars and bring it down to limit to just existing guests, for example, people who have already been authorized, or limiting it to only people in your organization. Personally, I recommend limiting it to just people in your organization. We don't like sharing outside of the environment because it's very easy for that to be taken advantage of. But one of the things that we do see as well is that oftentimes anonymous access can be enabled inadvertently. So, what that does is allow anybody who's got the link to view the file, modify the file, download the file. Now, if this is a press release going out about your new widget, maybe we don't care. All right, the hackers have your press release and the newspapers are about to tomorrow anyway, whatever. If we're talking salary data, if we're talking sensitive customer data, if we are talking trade secrets and intellectual property, that is a much bigger problem. So making sure that you're aware of how are people able to connect into my environment and access my data, how am I sharing these things with business partners and vendors is all very important. On the right here, we've got a couple other settings. The first is disabling apps that don't use modern authentication. So this is like Office 2013 and earlier. I personally have not found a good use case why Office 2013 should still be allowed. So I personally am in favor of just nuking it. Block access from apps which don't use modern authentication for the reasons that we just talked about on the previous slide. It's very unnecessary, especially if you're a small workforce with current computers, current applications, and everything. We have no need to be allowing that kind of insecure stuff. And then down below is the sync button. If you're browsing OneDrive and you see a thing which says sync to my computer here, do you want to allow that? Do you want to allow that from computers that the company owns? Or do you want to allow that from all employees who maybe installed OneDrive on their personal living room computers? These are questions to be discussed as you are going through and setting things up. Email security policies. This is another one where we see a lot of organizations think that they've got things turned on because they see the options there, but they've never done a deep dive into actually setting things up. So if you take a look at this list with the red brackets around it, those are the 5 main policies which are made available to most Office 365 tenancies. I haven't seen one yet which doesn't have them, but I'm sure at certain license levels they're out there. But on the whole, if you've got E3 or E5 or some combination thereof, these policies are available to you. But again, they have to be turned on. Anti-phishing protection actually does nothing until you open the policy and you assign users into it. Otherwise, it's just sitting there going, I could be doing phishing protection for you. Let me know when you're ready. And so making sure that employees are configured in there, that Office 365 knows, yes, this account, I need to be watching for lookalike user accounts. I need to be watching for people who are trying to pretend to be CEO123 at gmail.com, for example. That's how you turn on those features. Same thing goes for anti-malware, safe attachments, and safe links. Now, these are all specific to email, so this is going to be specific to scanning email attachments as they come in. Safe links, for example, is the service which will scan a URL which comes in by email and potentially rewrite it in the email. So that way, when the employee actually goes to click on it, they're not going to mybaddomain.com. They're going to a Microsoft address, which then scans the link first, makes sure that it's legit and trusted. And then if it's not, it will generate an alert and tell the employee, I can't let you go here because this website is too risky. Now, to the individual who asked the question about how do I stop the attackers from setting up lookalike Office 365 pages, Fred's right, you don't. This is one of the ways that you can help stop those links from coming into your environment, though. It's not foolproof. This is not 100%, but it is absolutely one of the ways to set up policies which will prevent that kind of stuff from coming in and reaching your users' inboxes.
Couple of quick questions that came in the chat here. Michael
Yeah.
wants to know, can exceptions be made for certain applications?
That's a complicated question. I'm going to answer it with yes, but there's going to be an asterisk after that. And if there's a specific use case that somebody would like to chat about, then let us know. We'll be happy to.
All right. I feel like there's an asterisk. All right, keep going. We'll come back to that one.
You bet. Additional policies to set up. So Microsoft Intune is the device management application. If you've ever heard of or worked with a System Center Configuration Manager, Intune is the new incarnation of that, and it's intended to work over the cloud, over the internet. So when you've got employees who take a laptop home, they're still getting configuration updates and data, and they don't have to be VPN back into your network first. But it's important to make sure that you get policies set up and configured here. It again is not set up to enforce itself out of the box, for example. So these policies, the ones that we recommend, number one, enforcing antivirus and EDR. We don't want to allow employees to turn off antivirus because they think, oh, it's just making things run slow, or kept giving me all these weird alerts. I was going to bad websites, but I knew they were fine, so I just made it go away. We don't want that in the slightest. Number two is enforcing BitLocker. This is disk encryption on your laptops and mobile devices. And we want to make sure that it registers the recovery key within Azure, within Office 365. If you've ever heard those horror stories from the Windows 7, Windows 8, Windows 10 days of deploying BitLocker, and then somebody takes their laptop on a flight and they're sitting there trying to use it and they can't get on Wi-Fi, and it pops up with the blue screen saying, your hard disk is encrypted. I need the recovery key before I'm going to let you in. This is why you want to have that recovery key stored. That way, somebody within your IT team can very quickly go and get that recovery key and help the employee remotely. Number three here is enforcing the Windows firewall. This is one where I don't see employees disabling it all that often. I usually see Windows disabling it. A lot of times these are policies which are enforced by on-premise Active Directory domains through group policy objects or GPOs, or IT turns it off deliberately because the Windows firewall sometimes can be hard and can block access to stuff that they want to allow. Uh, don't disable the Windows firewall. Again, speaking as somebody who's been working in incident response for the last several years, don't disable the Windows firewall. In fact, we want to use policies which enforce the Windows firewall and make sure that it's turned on, not just for things like public networks like Starbucks hotspots, but also in home networks, also in your business network environment. You don't want to just have folks come into the office and suddenly all their shields have dropped. You want to know if ransomware or malware gets loose inside your network, are we going to make it as difficult as possible to pivot around to other computers? And that's where the Windows firewall comes into play. Setting up Defender for endpoint configuration options. There is a long list of options and switches which can be set for Defender, and some of them are worded kind of confusingly. There's one in particular which says put EDR into block mode. What you'd think by that is I want Defender to stop bad stuff that it sees. On the surface, that would make a lot of sense. That switch actually puts it into a passive mode where it won't stop anything, it will just let you know about it. But it's worded very confusingly inside the setup screen. So these are things to be aware of. And if there's something you're not quite sure about, Google it. Go look it up. Absolutely. If you've Googled it and it's still not making sense, let us know. We'll be happy to chat with you, explore your use case, and help make a recommendation for you. And
Microsoft
then
wants you to use Bing, just so you know.
Thank you. Didn't even think about that. I heard Microsoft engineers around 2010 were telling me, yeah, we're going to Google that with Bing. So the third one here is setting up Defender for Cloud Apps policies. So we talked a little bit ago about Defender for Cloud Apps and securing things like Dropbox and Salesforce and HRIS systems. Those are going to be the policies which set, yes, I want to allow my employees to connect to Salesforce from inside the country while they're on a company computer. No, I don't want them to connect to Salesforce from Romania from an unmanaged computer. Setting for security, additional policies. This one here, we're going to be talking about a couple more detailed things, in particular PowerShell, but also the log retention. So where we had talked about the differences between E3 and E5, this is where that policy gets applied. We want to build an audit retention policy, which is going to say, for these types of records, for these types of logs, we want to store them 3 months, a year. Even 10 years is an option. That does cost quite a bit extra. And I don't know an organization that needs to keep sign-in logs for 10 years for normal IT purposes, but that's one to definitely discuss and explore with your compliance group if it is necessary here. But the important part to remember is that just buying the license does not turn on the feature. And I'm going to keep coming back to this because it's very important for Office 365 admins and owners to recognize here. Just because you're paying for it does not mean those services are turned on or set up correctly. This last one down here is disabling employee access to Exchange Online PowerShell. Now, if you haven't heard of PowerShell, I don't blame you. It's not something that folks who are not IT administrators tend to need very often, but it is very powerful. This is the command line replacement. This is the new generation of the DOS prompt, for example. What Exchange Online's PowerShell allows is for somebody to open a command prompt on a computer, connect to Office 365, and then be interacting with the mailbox and the environment. Now, that's great if you're an IT admin and you're doing some very specialized stuff. You need to make changes on hundreds of accounts very quickly, or you need to write a policy and you want to do it through command line. That's great. I'm totally in favor of that. If you are a normal employee and you don't know what PowerShell is, we want to disable that, because if you accidentally get malware running on your computer, we don't want to allow it to connect to Office 365 by PowerShell and potentially do some bad stuff. So just nuking PowerShell for employees who don't need it is one of those defense in depth layered strategies which can help stop malware in its tracks. And then we get into testing for security. So if we've gone through and we've set all these things up, we've checked all the boxes, we've set up all the policies, that's great, but we still got to make sure that it works like we want it to. So first up, I recommend testing this quite regularly, especially when you make a change. You want to verify that it's doing what you think it is, it's blocking what you think it is, and that if you're doing something which is generating alerts, that they're going to go where you want them to do. So one of the ways that I recommend this is by running test scripts on your computers. If you've got Defender for Endpoint, they've got an onboarding script which generates an alert. It pretends to do something bad on your computer, doesn't actually do something bad, but that will generate an alert, which you can then make sure comes into your inbox. If you don't see that alert, something's wrong. Same goes for testing things like impossible travel. If you use a VPN service from a computer to sign in from Germany and you know you're logged in from Seattle at the same time, that should trigger an alert. If it doesn't, there's something wrong here. And then also testing the security controls. Try logging in without MFA. Can you force a password reset without MFA? Can you try getting into various services without being in your company computer, for example? All of these policies, if you have set them up in very specific ways, we want to make sure that they're working as intended. And then once you've tested it, test it again. Once a quarter or so, we recommend going through and rerunning these tests. Sometimes it's just an hour and somebody with a laptop and a VPN service. But we also recommend a broader testing plan with things like an annual pen test, which includes Office 365 and cloud applications in the scope. A couple of ways you can look at that is by testing outside access, where there's no account or password provided, and then it's up to the attacker, the offensive security team who are doing the pen test, to try and get into an account without that information. But then you can also test seeded access, where you've given them a username and password, and you want to make sure that that username and password only works under specific conditions, like while you're in the continental US and not while you're in Romania. I don't know why I'm picking on Romania. Romania
You
has
really are.
nothing to be.
Hey, and Jean-Luc, you talked there a lot about alerts, and so I want to get to the alerts that the SOC gets and sees and does. Lola, can you tell us a little bit about what the SOC sees, what kind of things the SOC goes after?
Yeah, absolutely. The SOC has caught some pretty interesting events, but also some just practical events that really touch on a lot of what Jean-Luc just focused on, which is mostly configuration, because having the right configuration set up is one of the most important components of utilizing these tools. When I think about an interesting event that we have caught through the O365 data, one I can specifically think of is we identified a client user who outsourced and subsidized their work to an overseas contractor. They did this by passing off their credentials and internal knowledge as well, like the resources and all of that insider knowledge that we try to protect. And obviously they did that without approval. So that was something that was really important for us to catch for the safety of that client. With remote work, that concern has been amplified, although it is not limited to it. And so don't think it's only a remote work problem. When I think about something more practical related to some of those configuration details that JLP focused so much on, I remember the SOC assisted identifying legacy authentication protocols on a network that were not actively supported by MFAs. So part of implementing the tool of MFA, as we have discussed in this presentation, is really understanding what is in my network and also does it meet the requirements of this tool I'm adding in my network, so it's protecting what I think it is. When we reported this to the client, they actually had told us that it was legitimate and they pushed it off, and we challenged them due to seeing some of those legacy authentication protocols and got them to see that it really was not legitimate. It was a compromise. MFA was bypassed. So that's an example of sometimes just making sure that when you are doing the setup, you are doing it 100% for your network and understand all those intricacies.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. And so when we think, about what our SOC does, so this is what Critical Insight SOC does. We watch on-prem networks. On the left, you see there cloud environments, AWS and Azure, remote endpoints. JLP mentioned Defender and the like, and then O365. So all of that flows to the SOC, which is what Lola is talking about. And then, we take rapid quarantine actions. I'm bringing this up just to clarify. Thomas asked in the chat, are we talking about Microsoft SOC or our SOC? It's our SOC. I said Lola SOC. Lola runs it. So Lola, so we talked about all of these alerts. You gave those stories. How does the SOC, how does our SOC respond to an event? How does it work if you have a SOC looking at it?
Yeah. So the first thing is identifying the security concern, right? So we have an alert that triggers. What does that mean? What is the analyst really looking for? What actions are required to identify that type of information? So really just getting the grounding of what does this alert mean? What am I looking for? So because that kind of helps you start your scope and your next steps. Second, you're going to review known activity documentation. So any internal notes you have, that might be that maybe certain users, actions, or details such as like a source IP geolocation, they have been documented as authorized or expected. So for us, we want to make sure before we ever escalate anything to a customer, which takes their valuable time, is this something they need to touch, or do we already know that this is authorized? Maybe they have a location in this area, and so that's okay for them. So really reviewing that information allows the SOC to close out those alerts and be able to meet those preset requirements without escalating to the client. After that, you really need to identify a baseline because users do different activities and you're not always exactly sure what that can be. So what are the assets involved in the event? By identifying those assets, you can then create your baseline, which allows the alert to have context and assist in really identifying, like, is this anomalous or is this typical activity that can occur on the network for this user? It also creates the opportunity for false positives to be identified. An example that I want to talk about on that is potentially you have a possible O365 brute force trigger. You're going to go into it with the idea of something failed and then like a user failed and then successfully logged on while a brute force was occurring. Was it a true brute force log on that was successful, or did a regular user fail in that process and also successfully log in during that process, triggering the alert when it's not actually so? So that's something to just think about, and we need to identify, is this legitimate before we continue the investigation from there. After that, you really need to pivot across data sources. It's so important to pivot. O365 events can be correlated to multiple other data sources, Azure, Windows logs, which, report off of user activities and events, EDRs, which will, really focus on file hashes, different files downloaded, things like that, that can provide some additional information. But really to pivot through the data sources, you want to identify some unique field values that will allow you to then pivot and gather all the data pertaining to the event. You're going to find a lot of like really good nuggets that will start to tell the overarching story of what's going on to the event in question. The next couple things we're going to talk about are things you want to do while you're doing the investigation. So while investigating, use vetted and trusted tools. That's very, very important. You don't want to just use willy-nilly open source tools that you don't know might like record the file name that you put in there, exposing some internal information, different things like that. But you do want to use tools that you can utilize, such as IP lookups. You want to look up a report off of the IP. Basic social engineering skills, such as investigating an organization's website to identify locations. You can also do that for users. You can think like LinkedIn and things like that. From there, you want to document the entire time. I cannot repeat enough how important documentation is. All findings need to be documented, including no findings, because no findings are very relevant and they are still findings and they tell that story from when you were doing the investigation. So notes, screenshots, anything that's ultimately leveraged for the final conclusion of the investigation should be captured so you can look at that later. You're also going to be encouraging a longer shelf life for that investigation because now anyone can go and look at what you did. It allows for accurate peer review if you pass off to other teams. And for us specifically, that's really helpful because we always make sure to have peer reviews before we escalate up. So we need that evidence captured. And we don't want to have additional investigative work when someone's already done that investigation, right? They really need to capture that. So really, really focus on always adding all the documentation possible. And then those are the notes that the analyst will review holistically to determine, should I escalate or should I close out without escalation to the client? From there, quarantine the devices and users and respond as you go. So depending on the outcome of the investigation, we may isolate a device or lock out a user until the issue is resolved. But there are also things that you can do besides that. Reset passwords and sessions and re-image machines. I really also want to really quick focus on sessions because you may reset a password, but a session may still be active. And so that can have drastic consequences if you don't shut that off because you're giving the opportunity for the attacker to still take advantage of that open session when you might think you're in a safe spot because you changed the password. So clean up while you go is really important and goes hand in hand with then quarantining the device or user and re-imaging the machine.
Awesome. So, one of the things, we do a lot of Q&A. I just want people to know a couple of things before we answer all the questions here. It is 55 after, so we are going to go a little bit over the top of the hour. So before we go over the top, because I want to make sure we get all the questions here. So I do want folks to know before we do that, if you have to go, my colleague Ginny is going to put a couple of links in the chat. One of them is our survey. We do a survey at the end of all of our events because we want to know, hey, was this helpful? Did we give you what you needed? And everybody who takes the survey, we make a donation to the Society for Information Management. So we really appreciate it when you take the survey. The other thing that that Ginny's going to put is a meeting link. If anybody wants to sit down with Fred or JLP or Lola, you can schedule a meeting with us. It's on my colleague Ellie's calendar, and then she'll make sure that the time works and everything. And I've given my email address out a bunch of times, but jake@criticalinsight.com is a super easy way to get in touch with anyone here. But now we're going to go and we're going to answer all of the questions that were in the chat that we can. All right, everybody, get ready. Here we go. So let's see here. Forrest wants to know, oh, good luck with this one, Fred. Does an E3 subscription level provide enough info for the CI SOC, or is an E5 subscription needed? Don't you love all the Microsoft levels?
So that's a loaded question. So E3, we get alerts. So what you get there is, here's what's going on, but we don't get the contextual information that really helps us to take those alerts and do something really useful with them. So we really lean into E5 as being, if you want the full service and as much data as possible, that's what we're going to tell you we want. We can provide the service at E3 though. So it's just not quite as robust. And unfortunately, Microsoft has decided security information is what they're going to make you pay for. And sad but true.
It is very frustrating that that's true. Shane asked earlier, Jean-Luc, when you were presenting, any insights about autopilot?
Ooh, this is autopilot is in the OpenAI type code generation tool.
I assume so. Is that what you mean, Shane? You can put it in the chat.
Yeah.
That's what I assume.
If so, I don't have a ton of insight around it. I'm working with some organizations who are finding ways to incorporate it. What I'm hearing is that it is beneficial, especially for, I hate to use this term, but like lower level coding work stuff where, it's more about the syntax and the format rather than the complicated stuff that's going on. I've been hearing from some teams that helps advance their capabilities by orders of magnitude. So rather than like 10 or 20 hours to get something up and running in a very simple way, they just say, write me a thing, and then they've got it and they're off and running. I'm personally concerned about IP ownership. I know there are some who say very specifically, like, you own whatever code gets generated out of it. I would say absolutely check that. Make sure that you understand who owns what, and make sure that you're not providing information to them that you don't want to be. But otherwise, my jury is still out on that one, I'm afraid.
And I'll just say about AI, in everything I've used it for, you want to check the work. Absolutely check the work. I mean, we've all read articles about AI getting something wrong. There was a point at which you could put in Bing chat, who is Jake Milstein, and it said I was married to somebody who I'm not married to. So, I think you got to pay attention to that. That was a super interesting discussion. Okay, let's see. Thomas says, does E3 with the add-on security work, Fred?
Yeah. So as you probably have heard from that question, there are add-ons. You can add on different packages along with E3. Yes, those do provide, usually, depending on the package, the additional security features you miss. But it's still, even with the add-on packages, you still lack a few things you would get at E5. So it's not like you can get E3 and buy the E5 security features. You can buy most of them, though. Yes.
Awesome. All right, let's see. Other questions that came up here as I scroll up. Let's see here. Oh, and Fred, I think you answered this one from Daniel. Can you guys comment on the recent Awkill tool using vulnerable signed Microsoft drivers and M365's ability to detect it?
Yeah. So the little bit I know, I have been following this because this is really interesting, is they have finally revoked the certs for those where those drivers were signed with. I think that means, though, if you have not updated your Windows system to update your certificate store, it's still going to go, oh, that's a signed driver, and I'm going to run it. So I believe last week there was a huge patch cycle on Tuesday, and I think that was one of the fixes in there.
Cool. And John-Luc, earlier you asterisked your applications question, your exceptions to applications question. Michael then followed up and said they have some legacy applications. They're a school. Teachers are likely to have exam generators or other software for labs. By the way, the students, of course, are using ChatGPT for those exams, but he didn't say that. Sorry, go ahead. So application, go ahead. What was your asterisk and what's the answer there?
That's a tough one. The asterisk is that there are some applications where that can be done in a way that's secure, and there's some applications where it can be done to make them work, but it's absolutely not secure. The other challenges to be aware of are especially around legacy applications. If folks are running old applications, stuff that they've been carrying around with them for a decade because they bought the license 10 years ago and it still works, why should I have to buy the new one? If they're installing those on company computers, on system managed computers, that can get very risky very fast. Again, with the same concerns around things like Office 2010 and Office 2013, we don't like seeing those on endpoints because of the risk they incur, because of the way that they connect into the environment. Similar for other applications out there, like they've all got their own risk profiles and posture, which goes along with that. But if there is something specific that they'd like to chat about, by all means, let us know. We'll be happy to have a conversation.
Awesome. And Julie asked a question for the policies. Is there a way you can target your entire organization or a mail group, or is one limited to choosing certain individuals?
Yeah, with that one, the unfortunate answer is it depends. It depends entirely on which policy we're talking about. There are some which can only be turned on at the entire domain level. You're turning it on for Office 365 or not, and there's no granularity in there. There's some which can be applied to security groups or device groups, and there's others which can be applied to individual users, where you literally load every user up who you want to have it apply to here. So it depends on which policies we're talking about, and unfortunately, it's not consistent across the board there.
Hey, John-Luc, how many cybersecurity consultants does it take to change a light bulb? It depends. Okay. All right. Daniel asked, travel exception groups. Have you seen orgs successfully implement this through good old-fashioned company policy? And I answered, we do that, but
Yeah, exactly. This is something that I've seen in effect since around 2010 or so. I've worked at organizations that had this. I've advised organizations to roll this out. I've helped organizations as they roll it out, both large and small. There's just a little bit of a hump that first starts up as everybody goes, "What? I have to let you know when I'm going on holiday? This is ridiculous." And yeah, you're right. You don't have to get email while you're on PTO. If you don't want email, that's fine. Don't have them add your group or your account to the exception. Then your phone doesn't work. Other than phone calls and checking your personal email and everything. So it's always an option to just not. But overall, the process itself is very straightforward. They send in a help desk ticket or send an email to IT. I'm going to be traveling to Thailand from this date to this date. Please make sure I can check my email remotely. They add you to a security group. That automatically applies the rules. You're good to go. You come back, then either you send an email which says, "Hi, I'm back. I'm good now," or they set a calendar appointment which reminds them, just pull them out of that, and then you're good to go. The workflow sounds complicated, but it's just a couple of steps, and it doesn't take much for folks to get used to it. And again, worst case scenario, while they're out and traveling, then they just send you a message, "Hey, I can't check my company email. Can you help me?" And somebody just has to add them to the group, and then they're enabled.
Yeah.
Yes, Karen, you can add it to your security user security policy, your acceptable use policy. You can make it a set standalone policy, whatever is going to be appropriate and applicable there, based on your policy set and your company culture.
All right. I think that captures all of the questions. Um, and right, since it depends on which framework they're using. Yeah. I True that. I do want, if Jenny is still on, if you can re-add the survey link, that would be awesome. I want people to take that survey because we've gotten a lot of feedback, and I think our feedback on the survey is going to be good. And so I'd love to hear what else you all have to tell us about this webinar. For folks who had to leave, who we stayed an extra 5 minutes, I really appreciate it. My email address is up there, as is Fred's. The surveys in the chat, and we really appreciate you coming to this. One very last thing, Fred always gives a great last word on everything. Fred, I'm going to put you on the spot here. Last word, and then we'll split.
Yeah, everything you saw today should be baseline security for everyone. Anybody using these environments, if you're not doing this, you're kind of skipping square one. So this is critical you get this in place.
All right, everybody. Well, we look forward to talking to you about O365 settings. Oh, I just saw somebody said, do we do security checkups? We do. And just shoot us an email and we'll do security checkup for you. And if you want our SOC to watch your O365 environment, Lola is right on that. One of the wonderful things that happened in this webinar is a bunch of our customers went in the chat and talked about how much they love working with Lola. So, we look forward to hearing from you. Take that survey, shoot us an email. We'll send out the recording link and the PowerPoint. Thanks, everybody, and have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your week. Bye-bye.
Bye.